Welcome to the inaugural event in Peer's Victoria Speaker Series, Out of Harm's Way, Insight, Innovation, and Action on the Toxic Drug Crisis. My name is Jody Patterson. I've been around. I was a journalist for many years. I was a Peer's Executive Director for a few years. I've worked here and there. I know many of the people in this room. It's great to see so many familiar faces. This is the first of 3 speaker events on the crisis, which was declared a provincial emergency more than 8 years ago now, but continues to kill 150 to 200 people every single month. Our educational series opens today with the history, context, and complexity of this issue. Today we're opening the series with a dialogue among 6 people who have spent years, in some cases decades, witnessing the impact of the toxic drug crisis in their personal and professional lives. They've been among the strongest voices in BC in advocating for meaningful change. But before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge this event is taking place in Lapointe territories and invite Rachel Atleo of the Songhees Nation to share some words and Sean Bartleman of the Sartlip Nation to share a song. I'd also like to thank and recognize Elder Gail Sam of Sartlip Nation for being with us here today. As we move through the proceedings of the day, it's important to remember whose territories we are on and to consider how displacement from homelands and culture is interwoven through the opioid crisis. We're very grateful that Rachel, Sean, and Gail have agreed to join us today. Rachel and Sean, would you like to come up?
Asiam Nistrelacha asa Rachel Atleo chisa ethasin at Lakongan, Aishka Kwanzane etha tia Enoch, Aikwan Statel at the Elangang at Lakongan, Aikwanis Konanga Hela, Aishka Siam. My honorable friends, I'm Rachel Atleo. I'm from here, Lakongan. Thank you for coming here today. Welcome to the home territory of the Lakongan people. It's good to see you all. Thank you, honorable ones. And thank you for asking me to welcome you all with the work you do in a humble way. Enjoy this afternoon and hope your journey home is safe. Aishka.
I'd like to welcome harm reduction and recovery advocate Guy Felicella up as our first speaker. Guy is a very sought-after speaker on topics like the toxic drug crisis, having managed to survive 2 decades of being homeless and harmed by his substance use in Vancouver's downtown east side. He's been in recovery for 10 years. Guy, welcome.
The sadness is in this crisis is that it impacts all walks of lives, our loved ones, family members, friends, neighbors. It's not something that you just see on Pandora or in the downtown east side of Vancouver. It's hidden behind closed doors. It's open on the street. And the crippling impacts of loneliness and social isolation and that sadness that people struggle with how they feel and not having the ability to reach out and ask for support. There's many things that, and many faces of this crisis that are different but so complex. Sadly, we have experimental drug use, which can now be so risky, counterfeit substances. We have highly addictive drugs that are onto the streets that are causing even more catastrophic addictions, making it even harder for people to access recovery medical treatments. Withdrawal is punishing, painful. Sadly, we have people who work 12-hour shifts for the construction industry, and the physical impacts of pain and start getting medications just to function. We have created a society that fuels people to look for other ways to cope. These deaths are all sadly preventable, and we haven't been able to prevent them to the capacity. Addiction, for people who do struggle with it, is a chronic relapsing condition. And without a harm reduction safety net underneath that, sadly, people go back, use alone, and die. Unfortunately, in our world, is that people aren't recovering fast enough. They're dying faster than they can recover. And we have to do a better job at supporting people with all pathways. We have to understand that the division that sometimes exists between harm reduction and recovery needs to end. It's not helping anybody. We have to be understanding as well as that with that chronic condition that people go back to using, that the supports are in place. The drug supply is not getting better. It's getting worse. And even though when you hear words and news that the overdoses have started to decline a bit, that's today. I remember in the crisis, I asked this question in the 90s when in 2016 it hit. Did you actually think that it was going to leave in a year like it did in the 90s? And I don't know anybody that said, yeah, we thought it would go back, but it didn't. It's increasingly getting worse. And we still lose those loved ones, and the grief and loss and the ability to deal with that is just sometimes overwhelming. We blame things, the disinformation that exists in our world now. There's this war that's happening that you see, the political opportunists looking for votes, not looking to make changes, to toe a line. We're hearing things now like secure care, involuntary treatment. Instead of creating more voluntary treatment services where people can access them in a timely manner, we're seemingly to go back to what we already know failed in the 90s. And we haven't learned our lesson if we're going to let history continue to repeat itself. And so every one of us in here has a voice to stand up to disinformation. Sometimes I find these conversations can get very heated. But at the end of the day, in a lot of the conversations, and I've spoken right across the country, one of the things that I've noticed that's really changed the narrative is when people share their own personal stories and struggle, that people become relatable. You humanize people. They forget about what they're using or why they're using it. They understand the story behind the individual, and understanding the mechanisms of coping sometimes in our society is what are we doing that so many people are gravitating to using these substances? And what can society do better to change that? Because the reality is there's many factors: poverty, homelessness, trauma, foster care, unemployment, unaffordability. All those factors are leading people to try to survive instead of thrive. So we have to really call out our local governments, our municipalities, to actually create change. We're going to have to do a lot more than what we're doing. And, I wish that I didn't talk to family members that lose their loved ones. Seeing people go through treatment and complete it. The majority of people who have died of a drug overdose in the province of British Columbia have gone through treatment. And essentially, the rhetoric out there is blaming harm reduction for enabling people to continue in their addiction, when essentially what they should be looking at then is saying, would we say the same thing about recovery services for not keeping everyone sober? No. You can't blame harm reduction. It doesn't eliminate harm. It reduces it. Wearing a bike helmet doesn't stop crashes from happening, but it reduces the harm of the crash. Having harm reduction doesn't necessarily mean that people won't still overdose, but it will reduce the harm of that overdose. And the same thing with recovery, is that when people go through treatment and do very well and stay sober for 3 months and things get better, and then they go back, they're beaten down with this idea of being a failure. Recovery is a process. It's about learning from your mistakes. It doesn't mean that everything was a failure. That's the part about learning where you gain wisdom. And the important part about learning is trying not to make the same mistakes over and over again, because history just keeps repeating itself. The greatest gift that harm reduction has is all our services provide the one key thing that you all provide. That's human connection. There's nothing bigger or more powerful than being connected to people. You become somebody's friend. You hear their story. They trust you. And when they're ready, they'll reach out for help. That power of connection collectively helps people change their lives. I'm truly grateful to be here with a lineup of friends that I haven't seen in a while, and to be able to see you and the work that you do. No matter what happens, no matter what government's in power, I want you to understand this, that it doesn't change what we're going to continue to do to support people who are struggling, right? So remember that. And on your dark days when you're down and beaten and not feeling up to it, I want you to go and share that with somebody, because we don't talk about shit. And we need to start talking about it. You want to help others, you got to help yourself. If I'm not good, then I'm no good to anybody. I want to make sure that you guys take care of yourselves, because that is the most important thing, because the work you're going to do is going to be challenging, complicated. You might even get sworn at today. But I want you to know that no matter what, nobody meant it. It wasn't you. It was the frustration of the life, because these people are reaching out for help every freaking day and not getting it. And you just showed up. They didn't. You keep showing up. People are always going to remember how you made them feel. They'll never forget you one way or the other. So just remember, people care because you care. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Guy. Important words. I'd like to invite up our second speaker now, Lacey Jones. She's from the Snuneymuxw First Nation on her mother's side, and her work as director of QomQem Coastal Connections has earned her much recognition as an innovative and inspirational leader of Indigenous approaches in the toxic drug crisis. Lacey, welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My Hokuminam name is Mama Mathitya, and I come from Snuneymuxw Nation, as Jody mentioned. I also have German and Welsh ancestry through my dad as well, and I'm the outgoing director for QomQem Coastal Connections and the incoming director for FNHA's Toxic Drug Crisis Department. I've been there just for about over a week now, but still working closely with QomQem, just supporting as I kind of wrap things up there. And I was asked just to come today to share a bit about, I guess, setting kind of a tone and talking a little bit about how we've gotten to the space that we're at with the opioid crisis, with the toxic drug crisis, but from an Indigenous lens. So we have to kind of, most of us in this room, we're kind of inundated with information on social media and in the news about colonization, about residential schools, and all of the harms and the colonial violence that Indigenous peoples face every single day. But it's always important to kind of take it all the way back to the beginning. I speak from a place of being a Coast Salish woman, so I only really ever speak to the realities that exist here, especially down in southern Vancouver Island as in Coast Salish territory. So I always like to go back to settlement on the island here. So 1854 in Snuneymuxw was when HBC and the first settlers arrived there. So thinking about the ways that Indigenous people have always maintained our wellness and our health and our wholeness, and even the wealth of our nations has always been founded on how well we are as individuals, how well we are as families, how well we are as communities and nations. And all of our governance and our laws that translate into our culture and the way that we enact our ceremonies and our protocols we're always put in place by our ancestors to ensure that we could maintain that health, that wellness, and the wellness for ourselves and our communities. I think that was one of the foundational things that our ancestors have left us, right from, for Coast Salish people, thinking about our longhouses and the sacred things that we do inside those longhouses, to ensuring that we can go for river baths, staying connected to the land, to the waters, to our elders, and just engaging in our ceremonies all the time. So then we think back to the 1850s when HBC arrived, recognizing, they wanted all the resources that existed on Vancouver Island. They wanted the logs, they wanted the coal, they thought there was a bunch of gold here, all those things, so they decided to settle. The first thing they did was, take the land and dispossess Indigenous people and displace us, and really worked hard to disconnect us from that strength that we had and that we could draw on from connecting to the land. Fast forward a little bit, recognizing, they enforced the reservations, so we were all, taken and removed right from our lands and the connections that we could maintain to our ancestors through engaging in our ceremonies and our protocol. They put us onto reserves, restricted us often to those reserves. We weren't able to not only go and harvest and engage in all of the sacred and special things that we did to keep ourselves whole, but we also couldn't engage with our neighboring nations and our families that were around us because we were actually restricted to those spaces. And then fast forward again a bit more, and then we think about the theft of our children, the most precious resource that we have as Indigenous people, through the policies that were embedded for residential schools, mandated as, strictly enforcing our youth and our children to be taken and spend their lives in these horrific, violent spaces. And then fast forward a little more and thinking about the 60s scoop too, and how those policies shifted and just kind of morphed into our children still being taken and still being harmed. And then we can also think about the different types of health policies that were put into place. So thinking about the fact that it actually became super illegal for our people to be Indigenous through the potlatch bans, so not being able to practice our culture, not being able to engage our ceremonies. And again, as I mentioned before, our ceremonies and our culture, our laws and our governance, they are interconnected. You can't tease those things apart. So it actually essentially became illegal to be Indigenous in this country, on this island and in this province. And then thinking about, again, the Western lens and how we were it was forced on us to start taking up this really foreign way of what health and wellness looks like. We were forced, to start taking these medicines that were super foreign to our bodies. It became actually illegal to be harvesting medicines that we knew that were, healing, that had healing properties for our people, became illegal to practice. Again, like I said, with the potlatch ban, so we couldn't maintain our spiritual, emotional, mental, physical wellness through engaging in our laws and our governance in our longhouses. So just thinking about all the steps that the settler state has really taken in order to really establish itself and really worked hard to strip the power and authority of Indigenous people in these lands. And then fast forward to today, or starting in 2016, when this crisis sadly has hit. All of these things that I spoke about, there's so much intergenerational trauma that our people have been carrying for years and years, so much pain, so much harm. Things, they're starting to become these Western scientific revelations that we actually do carry trauma in our DNA. So things maybe that my great-grandmother went through, I never personally experienced them, but understanding that that's been passed down generation to generation. And then not only that, but just the socialization and the harms, that we've all grown into as Indigenous people. I remember thinking, growing up, the chaotic and the chaos that I grew up in. I have about 27 first cousins, and we all just thought it was normal for us as Indigenous kids just to grow up in chaos and grow up in anger, grow up in alcoholism. Nobody in our family ever talked about residential schools and how those impacted our family. My mom is one of 10, so all 10 of them were taken and put into the residential school system and spent majority of their adolescent lives in those institutions. And thinking about the harm that all of them experienced, and then they brought, that trauma into their parenting, or the lack of parenting that each one of them carried into their lives when they were raising all of us. And I actually didn't even hear about residential schools till I was about 15. I had no idea that my mom attended. I had no idea that all my aunts and uncles had gone either. I didn't even really know what they were. So just understanding that sometimes Indigenous folks, we don't always talk about the traumas that we've endured. Sometimes we don't even know until we get a bit older and can start sorting things out. But of course, just like anybody else, I'm thinking about what do we do when we're traumatized or when we're in pain? We're trying to bury that. We're trying to move forward or move away from it. And often, that's one of the main reasons our people turn to substance use, whether it's alcohol or different types of unregulated substances. There's just such a hole and so much trauma that we're constantly walking in, not only in our immediate families, but throughout our communities and our nations as well. So I was looking at the fact sheet actually that Jody had put together and thinking that Indigenous folks die at 6 times the rate of non-Indigenous people in this province and probably in the country as well. Recognizing again that Indigenous folks in BC, we only make up 3.8% of the population I saw, yet we're dying at 17.8%. Indigenous people represent, 17.8% of the deaths related to toxic drug use. So just thinking about how chaotic that is, and that's the reality that we live in, right? But also thinking about the violence, that the settler state has really pushed onto Indigenous people right from the get-go. And here we are today, looking for help, looking for answers. And I think one of the biggest things that we as Indigenous people have always done is thinking about that resiliency that lies within us, is that we're turning to ourselves, we're turning, to our community to be able to pull through and to build those relationships and strengthen, the experiences that our relatives on the streets or those that are using substances are experiencing. And Guy talked about, the power of human connection. And that's something just embedded into Indigenous culture and laws, is just that relationality and that connection for us to always, be together, whether we're eating, we're drumming, we're sitting with elders, or we're just sitting there in silence. It's that power of being together and coming together and holding one another up. And I think about moving forward, and as we move through this toxic drug crisis, I think one of the most powerful things for Indigenous people right now is the way that we're coming together as Native people to try and pull our relatives forward and to support them. I think of the work that QomQem has done. We're really grounded in providing Indigenous harm reduction, and a big foundation of that is connecting our relatives that have been disconnected and displaced from their culture, from their nations, from their families, from their language, from their governance, from their foods. The list goes on and on. And we're always working to pull people in to be able to have access to hearing drummers, to be able to be brushed off. We have Soph and John coming all the time to offer that medicine to the street community. And it goes beyond just being around the drum or just being brushed off with cedar. As Indigenous people, we know that that's medicine. We know that there is such a power that it's almost inexplicable. We can't explain the power that lies in the cedar or that lies in the drum or lies in those songs. And it's about coming together to provide that Indigenous care to one another so that we can help somebody walk through that day. You know, if they're feeling isolated, they can come to us and know that there's cultural connections. It's about offering that low barrier access to culture as well. Often in our communities, you know, there's these ideas about abstinence and accessing our culture. And I do understand for certain aspects of our ceremonies, there's an importance of being not under the influence in order to access things like sweats when you're, you know, physically your anatomy is going to change when you go into a sweat or other spiritual spaces. But there are powerful pieces of our culture that everybody should have access to. Our ancestors left us our culture in order for us to maintain our strength and maintain our identity and maintain that relationship and connection to one another. So the big thing that QomQem is offering is just that cultural connection. It's huge, and healing and building those relationships. And I think too about the IOW and the things IOW's done, offering seafood feasts. We understand that food is healing for our people. You know, hosting large events where folks can have access to crabs and clams and prawns and herring eggs and seaweed and salmon and halibut, and then Indian tacos for those people that maybe not from the coast or don't like seafood. But understanding, you know, not only the physical nutrients that lay in that, but the actual spiritual strength that we get from reconnecting back to our food, to our songs, and to our medicines. And understanding that the Colonial Project has worked so hard to remove us from all of those things. And it was the ultimate reason was to strip us from our power and our authority that we've held as Indigenous people in our territories and homelands. And I think the last thing I'd like to just say is just thinking about, you know, today and the next few series we'll be looking at things that we can do to move forward and move through this. And I think it's so important that that grassroots Indigenous-led and especially peer-led services are put at the forefront of addressing this toxic drug crisis. You know, we can't do this work without the folks that know firsthand what it's like to be struggling out there using substances from unregulated supplies, especially folks that are currently and actively using right now, because things are changing so fast, you know, even within the last few years. And secondly, having Indigenous-led, peer-led organizations and programs are so important, because we know as Indigenous people what each other needs. You know, I can think to the IOW and QomQem and recognize we all come from different places on the island, the province, all throughout even Canada. And we all have had different upbringings, but we've all had, I always say we've all had the same upbringing. You know, we all know what it's like to grow up in rage. We know what it's like to grow up in alcoholism. We know what it's like to grow up with abuse. And we know what it's like to normalize that. And I think by us coming together and being able to connect with people that are using substances, they immediately know, like, I may have never met this person, but I guarantee you they've gone through some shit that I've gone through. So it's about seeing that, you know, that face and recognizing that those experiences are very similar, and then finding ways to pull that culture and that strength to move forward. And then really calling on government at all levels to start providing like stable funding. I just think about, you know, the work for QomQem, for Solid, for PHS, for Kool-Aid. We're always piecemealing our Indigenous programming together. We're always piecemealing things together, and it's exhausting and it's tough, and it impacts the services that we can provide for people that need it most. So I just want to thank you all for coming today, and also just saying how honored I am to be here, to be invited with this panel today. I was a bit nervous, and like yesterday, last night, I'm like, I think I'm getting a sore throat. I don't think I can go, but here I am. So yeah, Aichka.
Thanks so much, Lacey. And now I'd like to welcome up our panel for a dialogue on how we got here, why we're still in crisis more than 8 years after the province of BC declared an emergency around toxic drugs, slowest ambulance arrival ever. Today we're bringing together former BC Chief Coroner Lisa Lapointe, Leslie McBain of Mums Stop the Harm, Canadian Drug Policy Coalition Executive Director DJ Larkin, harm reduction and recovery advocate Guy Felicella, and QomQem Director Lacey Jones. We're very fortunate to have former Provincial Health Officer Dr. Perry Kendall moderating this all-star dialogue and participating as an expert himself. As you see, we've got a talk show set up, and Perry will be our Jay Leno, our charming Jay Leno. I don't know how we managed to land all these incredible people in the same room, but I'm really looking forward to what they have to say. So come on up, panelists.
Why am I here? Well, I got deeply involved in drug policy many years ago. I helped open the first needle exchange program in Victoria. I went to Toronto, opened up a needle exchange program there, had the city council adopt harm reduction as an official city policy. This was at a time when harm reduction was very contentious. I came here to British Columbia, and we were then in the midst of an HIV, hepatitis C injection drug use sort of syndemic. And I was actually asked to co-chair a Health Canada committee looking at what are the impacts of HIV and injection drug use. And coming out of that, through an amazing combination of mayoral elections, CBC TV shows, community activism, Vandu, a movie fix, we were able to get BC, Vancouver, to open the first sanctioned supervised consumption site in North America. Actually, there had admittedly been numerous unsanctioned ones, particularly in Vancouver, in the years preceding that, but with the support that we got then, we opened up the first one as a scientific program, and the science that came out of it enabled us to withstand through the Supreme Court, a challenge that the Harper government tried to shut it down and stop people accessing a key component of medication, diacetylmorphine, otherwise known as heroin. And we went through in Vancouver an epidemic of deaths. 900 people were dying a day in a year at the peak of that epidemic. And the chief coroner, who preceded Lisa, wrote a report calling for legalization. We went on then for quite quietly, getting 200, 300, 400 deaths a day until the numbers started going up in 2014, 2015. And in 2016, with support from my colleagues around the province and community, I got thinking about declaring a public health emergency under the Public Health Act. It doesn't give you many more powers. It was designed to deal with measles and toxic substances other than drugs. But it did give us, it did two things. One, it raised the profile significantly within the government, and we had a health minister at the time, Terry Lake, who was very interested in this. Possibly, I think, because his daughter was taking a master's degree at the BC Centre on Substance Use and was telling him what the science was and what he should be doing, and he went along with it. And we declared a public health emergency, and that got a lot of action. And in fact, over a couple of years, we did see by 2019 a 30% decline in the overdose deaths. And then, as you all know, what happened in 2020, COVID came along and sort of blew the whole thing apart. And we now are facing what academics, intellectuals, or economists call a wicked problem. It's a problem that has numerous root causes, one of which is the idiocy and the ignorance of our drug laws. They're really stupid. If we had any other policy that was resulting in people dying at the rate that they currently are, we would just change it like that. If anything else was killing people at the rate that they're dying in Canada, we would take immediate action. And so we have currently a wicked problem with no simple solutions. Anybody who says that one solution is going to work is ignorant. and they're probably lying to themselves as well as lying to you. I mean, we obviously have to deal with dissociation, with poverty, with estrangement, with ongoing lack of access to mental health services, lack of access to primary care, and for which people themselves are being blamed, an increasing inequality and lack of access to housing, to affordable housing, with rising numbers of people who are forced to live on the streets. When I say that our policy is dumb, I could go back to look at the Americans, what was happening in the 80s and the 90s with overproduction of opioid prescriptions and a lot of prescription-derived addiction among the communities in the United States who had lost their jobs through globalization and the lack of coal mining and factories, etc., moving abroad. When you have millions of people who become addicted to opioids, what would be the least sensible thing to do you think? How about cutting off the supply, the safe supply, even though people were dying at rates? The market, the black market, the demand was still there, so the black market moved in. First heroin, and because heroin is bulky, you had to deal with warlords, cartels, mafia. Why not move to synthetics, which can be manufactured in illegitimate pharmacies, mostly, I think, on the Chinese mainland, which offer 100 times the profit, are easier to smuggle, and have such intense toxicity, such intense potency, that there's no way you can get a safe drug supply. And that kicked off the epidemic of deaths in the United States. And we saw much the same thing happen here. The drug supply changed year by year by year, and we're now left with a toxic, unregulated drug supply, which is why many of us are calling for a serious adult conversation about the regulatory schema that we're currently forced to work under. So that's been my interest, trying to reduce the toxicity, trying to improve services across the board, advocating for shelter, for medical care, for harm reduction particularly. And the toughest one, perhaps, is trying to advocate for change in regulations and a serious conversation about that. I kind of worry that at the moment we're at an inflection, having made progress somewhat over the years in terms of the policy and the programs. I think we're now facing it's like a 2 steps forward, 3 steps back situation. So I'm hoping that this discussion and the thoughts we'll hear from the panel today and from the audience will help us move forward in a positive way to overcome some of the challenges that sometimes seem to be overwhelming.
I lost my son Jordan. Next week will be 11 years ago. Myself and 2 other women who had similarly lost their sons to drug harms. We got together, sort of serendipity, and we co-founded Mom Stop the Harm. Our main goal was to support the lives of people, support and save the lives of people who use drugs. So I'm not a statistician, but I'm going to throw some numbers at you that you may already know, but it's good to have a sticking point here. Since Dr. Kendall announced the public health emergency here in BC, across Canada, 50,000 individuals have died from drug harms, mostly from the toxic drugs. Now, if you assume that each one of those people has maybe 10 family members who are plunged into forever grief, that's 500,000 people across Canada who will grieve forever. If you then say, well, let's see, they had coworkers and perhaps spiritual community and friends and others, maybe that's another 10 people affected by a death. That's 1 million people in this country who are grieving the loss of these. You saw these pictures of these kids. I'm going to call them kids because they're all younger than me. And they're all gone. They're dead. They're gone. I mean, that's stunning. We don't know how much grief this country's in, or places around the globe, from the toxic drug crisis. Just last week, I ran into a woman on a trail. We were walking, and she is the mom of a very close friend of my son. When my son died at age 25, his friend Tyler was about 26, I think. And I didn't know this before, but she told me her son Tyler went into a deep depression. He did not take drugs, thankfully. He had to go into treatment, into therapy for a long time, and he did get over it and had to move out of the country. I mean, we just have no idea what the ramifications are of all these deaths. We are still trying to change drug policy to ones that support and save the lives of people who use drugs. We've never veered from that, but we also now have support groups, which I see some members here are within those groups, Healing Hearts, for people who have lost a loved one, and holding hope for those many people who still have their loved ones with them but struggling with substance use disorder. I'm not going to go on. I think Perry and everybody has said quite a bit of what needs to be said to give context to this incredible crisis. I would just say that I am disheartened by the movement to the right politically, which impacts us, as Perry said, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. I think it's even worse than that. I feel like they're running back. We had solutions. Those solutions have been gutted. Some of them have not been followed. And here we are in really the worst public health crisis we've had, along with COVID. So thanks for having me here.
I'm going to ask perhaps Lisa if you would like to say a few words next. Lisa, as you know, is our past chief coroner who worked very closely with me.
Thanks, Perry. It's just such a privilege to be here, and thank you all for coming. I think lately, for many of us, it's felt like this is an issue that nobody wants to talk about anymore. And it's infuriating. I'll use that word. I find that infuriating when we see toxic drug poisoning as the leading cause of death in our province for people aged 10 to 59. How can this not be the most important priority for every council, every minister, every level of government in our country? And these deaths are preventable, and I think that's what makes us so frustrated. People do not have to die. We know some of the solutions that can be implemented to prevent their deaths. And, Guy talked about caring and connection, and harm reduction, of course, and treatment, of course. And there's a whole discussion we can have about treatment and the need to ensure that treatment is standardized and has regulation. And reporting on treatment outcomes. We can't put all of our eggs in one basket, so to speak. And safer supply, prescribed supply, my apologies, so that those who are struggling and who are not ready for treatment, or frankly cannot access treatment, because we know there are thousands of people in our province trying to access treatment and who cannot, then prescribed alternatives can keep them alive. It's the life jacket when they are drowning, and we need to have that too. So there are solutions, and as Leslie said, it's quite frightening now when we're seeing our leaders walking away from this crisis, trying to distance themselves from this crisis. And these are our family members, they're our friends, they're our community members, and they matter, and they should matter to everybody at every level of government, no matter where they are. And so I'm so grateful for peers for organizing this event today, and for this wonderful, knowledgeable, and compassionate panel that is here, and for all of you for being here. Because what you show by your presence is that this does matter, and the people who are dying do matter, and the people who are at risk, tens of thousands of people in our province at risk every single day, and of course, hundreds of thousands across our country. And by your presence here and by your care and concern, we can make a difference. So thank you for being here.
A few more words from your perspective, and then coming from a community who's particularly at risk.
To elaborate some more on some important steps, are just really finding ways for Indigenous and peer-led models to really start surfacing and to start like drawing on that expertise, you know, folks with the lived experience, but also folks with that knowledge related to Indigenous cultures, recognizing that Indigenous people disproportionately represent, you know, the deaths due to the crisis that we're in. I think it means about developing cultural models that are really founded on Indigenous paths for wellness, recognizing, you know, we got to this spot that we're in as Indigenous people because of the harms that the state has done to us, because of the policies that have been laid out since 1870 something. You know, everything that the Canadian state has ever done to us has been meant to harm us, you know, to strip us from, as I'd mentioned, the power and authority that we hold with connection to our territories, with connection to our governance systems and our governance structures. Prior to settlement, we can see our people were a super healthy people. I mean, not to make this dystopian society. We obviously had folks that caused harm in our communities and those things, but we also, we had harm reduction practices embedded in our culture. I shared a little bit about them. You know, folks still engage in going for, you know, our river baths in the morning. That's a way to ensure that we as Indigenous people can wake up in the morning and say, okay, yeah, we're still here in Canada. Most of this country still hates us. This policy is still like strictly against like everything that like ultimately it means for us to be Indigenous people. So I'm gonna get up and I'm gonna go and practice my culture to ensure that I can be strong for today, not only for myself and I can walk out into this world, but also for my families, the youth around me, my community, my nation, so that I can continue to share those teachings. So I think being able to draw on what our ancestors have left for us and be able to develop more culturally led programming, you know, to bring that strength back to our relatives that are struggling is so important.
Thank you. DJ, I know that your organization has conducted a cross-country series of engagements, and maybe that has given you some ideas as to how one could move forward on policy change or policy discussion. Can I
Sure.
hand that one over to you just to see?
I can give that a whirl. I mean, I had a bunch of notes and I'm not going to say any of them. So hopefully what I say makes sense. I think what I want to start with is this isn't inevitable and we have to believe that it isn't forever. It's not inevitable. We have to believe it's not forever. Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, the reason we focus on policy, we've got folks who are focused on community services and family supports and treatment and data and research. We are focused on policy because there is a legal and policy system that is causing harm. International law and Canadian law never got rid of drugs, but what it did was make a drug supply that changes every day. It made illegal markets that can cause violence in communities, that put thousands of people in jail, that, believe it or not, is causing deforestation in the Amazon basin and partly driving climate change. So that's why we focus on policy. And there's so many solutions around the table, but when you say wicked problem, it is a wicked problem because there are so many aspects to the harm that people are experiencing, but there's also pathways and solutions. So through Getting to Tomorrow, dialogues happened all across the country where we heard from people, but we consistently heard, we need housing that's accessible and safe. We need to know that there's going to be harm reduction in shelter and we're not going to be kicked out of shelters. Okay, so let's go work with the housing network folks and talk about this through a housing justice lens. We heard about policing. Okay, so what does that mean in terms of how we talk about decriminalization and what a intentional tragedy it was that when decriminalization was launched in this province, the resources were not put in to help the public understand it and misinformation was allowed to prevail. We heard about the need to deal with the drug supply and to deal with it in a way that is equity focused. So it doesn't create sort of, let's make safer access for a few people, maybe through dispensaries or people who have access to healthcare, but then leaving others out to still be policed. We really need to think of it through the lens of who is most impacted, how do we center that experience, and how do we build forward? So yes, it's a wicked problem, but I'm gonna suggest there's a bigger wicked problem. We are navigating deadly politics. Misinformation is winning the day. Half-truths are winning. Why? I'm going to ask everyone in this room, do we agree we are all here because we care and we are holding that crystal of grief? We have fear, we want change, and we want to learn. So I'm going to suggest something. We live in an era right now where being right is more important than learning, and changing your mind feels like a risk, like you'll lose your friends and family. So what if even the people who disagree with us hold fear, they care, and they want change, but they're being led down the wrong path? So that's my question for this panel. How do we create those spaces of learning, and how do we take all these crystals of what the future could look like to help draw that beautiful picture so people can see and can follow to something that would actually be more effective? We can defend what we have right now when we have to, but we also have to build something else. And that's where CDPC comes in, because policy matters.
Thank you. Guy, I suspect you're not the only person here with lived or living experience, but you're certainly the one who's willing to talk about it. Could you tell us a little bit more about perhaps the treatment experience and the expectations that just putting more treatment in place will fix the problem?
Yeah, I mean, abstinence is really, it's not a real world solution in the sense that it's part of the solution, but it's not easy to achieve. And depending on where the individual is at, what their goals are, what they're looking for, it becomes so complex, because in order to access treatment, you have to be abstinent. And in the sense where that becomes too challenging for somebody that's been using substances to cope their whole life, to actually give something away. And one of the things that we're forgetting about is that we focus solely on the drugs and not the reason why the individual's using the drugs. And when you tap into the why behind it, and especially sexual abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse, child and welfare, being made a ward of the court, the prison system, the punishment that's provided by institutions onto its people, it becomes very, very challenging. And if a person isn't ready to deal with trauma, or undiagnosed learning disabilities is another big one that I've discovered even in my own journey. I mean, I just thought I was stupid my whole life, and then I found out I had ADHD, and then it all made sense. And what started to really impact my life of change is that once I started understanding the underlying issues of why I used the drugs, the child trauma, the undiagnosed learning disabilities, it became much easier for me to look at focusing on addiction. And I remember the therapist that I had, because I put up a big prison wall to keep everybody out, because I was pushed into things that I didn't want to do and wasn't comfortable with. And he said, I'm not asking you to take the wall down. I'm just asking you to take one brick down and let some light in for a bit. And what I'd started to discover in my own journey was that walking into a supervised consumption site, which I do call it an aspect of treatment, because it was actually me saying that, hey, I don't want to use alone, I don't want to die, I don't like how I'm living, but I'm going to go here and hopefully something will change. And eventually It did, in the sense that I was so exhausted physically that I said, I just need to stop. And I just need to stop today and figure something else out. And I would go upstairs to the detox upstairs. And even though I looked at it being as very successful as just being able to clear my head, eat some food, talk to some people, starting to feel human again, not being in withdrawal, getting removed from the supply where I was, stabilized, felt better about myself, some self-esteem came back. And that process had to be repeated over and over and over and over and over until I finally got to a point where I realized that my whole journey, the battle wasn't out there, it was the battle with myself, and that I was gonna have to make significant steps of changing and getting help and asking for help. And I just chipped away at it, and I still chip away at it. I still go to therapy today, but it's been the journey of my success. I've never gone into this thing saying that I'm gonna stay off drugs for the rest of my life. I just tell people, just focus on staying sober today, and it's turned into almost 12 years. So when I look at it like that, it's like, I don't, if I do the same things, you have to create two things. You have to, but also the opportunity has to exist. In order to break free from a life, you have to create a new life where it's easier not to use the substances, but you also have to have the opportunity from the community, from employment, the social determinants of health. All that has to factor in, and you can't separate addiction and mental health from the other social determinants of health. It's not going to work. And if you look at the success rate of people who go through treatment, a lot of them have all the social determinants of health addressed. They go back to their families. Maybe they were a CEO of a company. They get their job back. They have their place to live. There's people in our world that have never experienced what that's like. And so they need the equal opportunity as well. And so if we do that, I think that's what worked for me and works for a lot of people. And I know how challenging it is, but we need it all.
Thank you, Guy. So for people who are addicted or dependent and have lots of problems, then there is a treatment aspect. And we recognize that that's for a chronic relapsing disorder. The parallels with sort of adult onset type 2 diabetes, where diet and exercise are something that people have to struggle to do, is I think, an apt kind of simile, if you like. But we also know that, from people who are dying, many of them would not have a medical diagnosis of opioid or other substance use disorder. And we also know that historically, for millennia, people have been trying to change their consciousness, the way they perceive things, for social reasons, for religious reasons, to experience different things, to talk to another world, to be social. There's a strong argument that beer actually came before bread. I mean, the classic thing is that we became agriculturalists, we grew corn, and when the corn was enough, we would brew beer and have that. The other theory is, no, we actually grew corn first so as we could drink beer and experience things differently and socialize, and if there was anything left over, we made bread. My point here is that people have been trying to change their consciousness for thousands of years. Even non-human primates will eat fermenting berries and seek them out, and so will birds. So I just wonder, some suggestions as to how we look into that, how we take into account of the fact that occasional social or recreational use of controlled substances is frowned upon, but alcohol is not. Currently, alcohol is more available than it's been in 50 years, I would say. Tobacco we've dealt with. 20 years ago, people were talking about, why don't we ban tobacco? The first thing that law enforcement said, are you crazy? With 6 million addicted people, we'll just have a black market that we can't control. How do we, I'd love to hear some ideas from the audience about how we actually start addressing the other part of what has become part of the tragic death toll. People who are occasionally using either for pain and overdosing or because they want to change the state of their consciousness. Would anybody like to have a crack at that? Leslie?
What you say is true, and people, all of us, well, maybe all of us, most of us here, have occasion to have a drink, smoke some pot, to do whatever it is that makes us feel better. The reason people use substances, and here we're talking about drugs, and here we're actually talking about the toxic drugs, is for one reason. They want to feel better. There is nothing wrong with that. There should be no stigma attached to wanting to feel better. There should be no stigma attached to suffering from alcoholism or from any kinds of addiction. It is stigma at the bottom of this entire issue that we're talking about today. It's stigma. Why do we not have a prescribed alternative for people who have in substance use disorder or addicted? Why do we not have? We have cannabis in stores that's regulated. We have alcohol that is regulated, highly addictive, and causes actually more dollars worth of harm in our culture than the toxic drugs. But you don't, get a martini and die from it. So it's stigma at the bottom of why our politicians, our policymakers, the lawmakers have not gone the way we know they could go, which is and it's not a complicated thing. I mean, it is a complicated thing, but it's not an impossible thing to change laws, to change policy so that people who want to or need to use substances have those substances that are regulated and safer. If we didn't have this stigma, the politicians are playing to the public, not you. You're all here because you understand and you're warriors in my eyes. But we have the public, the greater public out there who thinks that drug use is bad, it's immoral, people, all the rhetoric that people have around drug use. And so the politicians play to that, and that's here we are today with the toxic drug market that, as has been said, is growing more toxic every day, is more unpredictable every day, and we know the solutions. Treatment is one. We're hearing, I don't get into that, but we're hearing about involuntary care now. Well, wait, where's the voluntary care? Stop, just step back for a second. Let's get the voluntary care in place with the people, with the medical folks, with the therapeutic folks. We don't have that. So, we have to be critical thinkers, and thank you for letting me rant. I'll do it again.
DJ, you look like you were just ready to jump up and comment on that last one.
So your question about how do we move past this idea that we pretend like we haven't always used substances of one sort or another. So first, I don't necessarily disagree with your premise, but I'm going to suggest that we do totally accept recreational drug use. What we don't accept is a couple of things. The intersection of drug use with socioeconomic status, housing status, race, and indigenous identity. It's not about the drugs. You can go back to 1700s in England, where if you were wealthy and you drank a lot, it was a private vice, and if you were unhoused and you drank alcohol, you were criminalized. So it's always been about that intersection of race and economic class. And so I think we really need to figure out, how do we break through that barrier? How many people here know like a comedian who's made a lot of money telling jokes about their journey and their substance use? Rock stars. We do recognize it, but what people feel uncomfortable with is the notion that I feel like because I have housing, I shouldn't feel uncomfortable because someone else doesn't. And so I'm gonna call it drug use. Or I'm going to try to find a way to make sure that that person is policed and gone. And so it's really about that intersection, and we saw that with decriminalization here. There was huge backlash at the same exact intersection of massive increases in homelessness, but we didn't talk about that. We just talked about public drug use. So I think there's something there that we have to look at, because there is broad acceptance of recreational drug use. It's all about your class and your race when it comes to it. So what do we need to do, and how do we need to thoughtfully say people, I know we are struggling. I know we have people who don't have access to healthcare. I know our housing crisis is abhorrent. None of us want to see or feel this suffering. But how do we work together, with the Housing Justice Network, with health coalitions? How do we work to build that built messaging so that we're not accidentally being pitted against each other? I think that's part of the solution.
Lacey, you want to say something to that? You look like you did.
Sure, just to expand a little bit on DJ's comment about the ways, especially that Indigenous people are stigmatized. I think, again, I'm just going to be like that broken record talking about colonialism, but Canada, the state, US, anywhere that there's been colonization around this world, that settler state has always depended on Indigenous people being socialized and accepted by the new society, to see Indigenous people as dehumanized, as disposable. And there's multiple ways that happened through, the establishment of society and through policy and those things. So we can see that Indigenous folks, when they're overrepresented in the drug crisis, that they're up against, the social, up against racism. They're up against all of that colonial violence that exists because Canada is a country that it is today. So thinking about the ways, that stigma really does impact people. It's the understanding that society has really taken up these social norms about what they expect Indigenous people to be, whether that's alcohol. And I can think about alcohol, sure, it's socially accepted in non-Indigenous communities, but when we see a Native person drinking, immediately, often minds go to, oh, there's that drunk Indian again. Or, oftentimes I've been in restaurants and pubs and stuff, and I see a young, affluent-looking white couple with their kid sitting in the pub. And immediately, me and my partner, who is also Indigenous, he just laughs and he says, if that was, us doing that, or my sister here with her kid, MCFD would be here in 2 effing minutes to deal with this. So it's thinking about those social stigmas as well that are tied to the ways that I guess, colonization has really nestled itself into these territories. So then when we take that up a notch and think about, Indigenous folks using substances or unregulated supply, then what do people think? There's those lazy, unhoused, dirty Indians that are out there getting drunk and getting high and taking all the resources. They have all this stuff handed. They don't pay taxes. They can go to school for free. All these pieces that tie into that, that social stigma that just keeps society believing those pieces about what Indigenous people are, because it goes all the way back to settlement and what was needed here.
Is reconciliation and the move towards that making a difference in lives?
I often think about reconciliation, and I feel like we've been in this era of reconciliation for decades. And it just seems like this loop that we're playing, and I look, to my relatives that are struggling. I've been really blessed and lucky to get out of a space that I was living, in my trauma and just getting pissed drunk every day, just trying to forget about things. So I've been blessed, and I'm honored to, have been able to move to where I am today. But I think about my relatives and all of these decades of reconciliations and the hundreds of millions of dollars that has probably been sunk into reconciliatory actions. And I think to my relatives, and their lives are no different than they were 10, 15, even 20 years ago. So I don't know, I don't have a lot of faith in reconciliation right now for Indigenous people. I think, again, there's just so much tied to unraveling that social stigma, to actually having the government, the state, and I don't ever want to say the word acknowledge, because we as Indigenous people, we don't need the state to acknowledge our governance systems or our culture as valid, because it doesn't matter to us. We know inherently that that's where our strength comes from. We know that the power of our ancestors lies in our teachings. We don't need Canada to believe that, but we do need the validation of, in a sense, because that's where all the money is for our people. We know what we need to do to get better, but we have no resources in order to do so.
I mean, BC does stand out, I think, among other provinces in that we do, the First Nations Health Authority has at least some ability to plan, manage, make your own policies, and train people to help. So I think maybe I always hoped that was a small step forwards in one particular area anyway.
Yeah, and there's so much beautiful projects and programs growing out of FNHA and, led by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. So there is that cultural component being embedded into wellness. But I think on a broader scale, I often think about, I've worked with the street community now for nearly 10 years, and a lot of the folks that I've been connected to, they don't access services through the FNHA or through even health authorities in the region. So it's just making those pieces more accessible for folks who need it the most, the most vulnerable groups of people. So
I wish you all success in that. Hope well. I know, Lisa, do you have anything you'd like to jump in and add to this discourse?
Thanks, Perry. So we know that substances can cause harms. Certainly as a coroner, I went to scenes where somebody had died of acute alcohol poisoning. I went to scenes of death where somebody had died as a result of chronic alcohol use. I certainly went to scenes of death where people had died as a result of toxic street drugs and prescription drugs. I think we're all aware that substances can cause harms. We know that tobacco caused cancers for years and years, and now we have some worries about vaping and some of the health harms connected to that. And so I think what we're talking about is that prohibition does not make things safer, and that prohibiting the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, which makes a number of substances unlawful, illegal, and then therefore criminalizes people who are found in possession of or selling those substances, they are criminalized. And so if they are already struggling with harm, we are now layering on lots and lots more harm. And so I think it's important, because there is that right-wing ideology, and I hate to use that term because it's kind of, I don't know if it's that helpful of a term, that if we just ban it, and if we ban it harder, and if we have more police and more arrests, that will solve the problem. Except we've been doing that for decades, and it's only made the problem worse, and that's what DJ's talking about. So we need to be, again, and I think everybody's mentioned this, have the thoughtfulness and the willingness and the courage to look at this wicked problem where we are losing 5 people now every day. And that is better than 6 people every day or 7 people every day, but it's not acceptable. It cannot be acceptable on any level. And say, what do we need to do to change it? And then we need that whole range of options that we were talking about. So decriminalizing, for sure. Criminalizing people who are struggling with a health issue or interpersonal challenges or some of the trauma that Guy talked about has not been effective. So decriminalize has to happen. but then the programs have to be there for people. We do need we need obviously healthcare. Who can access healthcare? You know, especially people who are really suffering even harder. Mental health, access to mental health care, access to harm reduction programs, access to treatment on demand when people need it, humane treatment, humane care when you go into a hospital so people aren't stigmatized and made to feel ashamed and their families are made to feel ashamed. All of those things need to change, and it will make a difference, but it takes courage, and it needs people like us and people like Guy who tell their stories, and people like Leslie, the moms who tell their stories, because stories really do make a difference. To say, we've even heard from our police partners. The Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police came out about 3 years ago. We cannot arrest our way out of this crisis. They've since backtracked a little bit on that because the political winds are blowing a different way. But decriminalizing has to be part of it. And then how do we support people to be healthy? And I'm not a fan of big substance use of any substances. I've seen far too many harms from all of them, whether it's tobacco or alcohol or prescription drugs or all of those things can cause harms, but let's not make it worse with the current regime and the prohibition.
People don't want to let go of the label. They don't want to let go of that 1980s label, this is your brain on drugs. And we need to ask why, and we need to help people let go of that label. Because politicians are making it popular to keep it going, and it's why prohibition harms. It's why even if you use recreationally, as soon as you become harmed, well, now you have to feel shamed. Now you shouldn't tell anybody. Right? It's that label. So I think the question for me, like, what would you say to our premier, Dave, right now about, like, why are you so bought into this label? What do you think? What would you try to tell him or ask him?
Oh, I think I'd take him aside and have a serious conversation. I mean, I understand what he thinks are the political risks of doing this, but the human risks of not proceeding with it, I mean, that must be hard to live with, I would think. But anyway.
I would like to add to Lisa's recipe, as it were. We need to also look upstream. And we moms are, you know, as we're a little bit stuck now in trying to get better drug policies through, we've been talking to politicians for 10 years and not getting very far. But the upstream part of this is education of children. It's education of parents of children. It's education of children. It's education of counselors in schools and teachers to recognize, to understand, not be helicopter parents or anything like that, but to understand their children's emotional state. What's happening here? Do they need some support? Do they, you know, just what's happened? My kid had ADHD, also like Guy's undiagnosed ADHD. This was a big problem for him. I didn't know. I knew nothing about addiction. I knew nothing about drug use. And now I know, you know, if I only knew then, etc. But we need to actually catch them. There's a great, if you want to look it up, Google it, a program called Preventure. It's a Canadian-created, I'm not going to go into it, but it's for high schoolers, middle school to high school, for them to be able to understand who they are and what power they have and where their talents lie and you know, connect them with themselves. It's a great program. I think that type of program should be in all the schools. And then, of course, we need to have the information, the real goods on what the toxic drug crisis is in schools, how dangerous it is, what the risks are. They kind of know, but again, you know, being at a party and having somebody say, I got this pill from somebody that I know and it's really great and you got to try it. And I bring to mind Sydney Starko from UVic, who died about a year ago, I believe it was, and she was with her roommates at UVic in residence. I mean, we got to get those kids educated to the real goods, and parents, and so on and so forth.
And
Thank you.
To DJ's point, there is a stack of literature that shows that intervention does work. It saves lives and saves money. It saves brains. Yeah. Yeah. Well, Jody, are there any questions from the audience that we could mull over, talk to, try and answer? And the people who didn't put their hands up, maybe you could talk to us later about, what you disagree with, and we could discuss that perhaps and say why, what's the hesitation, are there answers that you would like that we haven't given you or can't give you so far?
Okay, I'll read these questions and then all of you can answer or jump in where you need to. As a service provider in supportive housing, what is the best way to support someone who's trying to abstain from drugs when the housing they're in is wet housing? Wet housing being, I'm sure most of the people already know, but housing where it's okay to use drugs.
I don't speak from experience here, but I would think that the best thing would be to try and have a wing that was voluntarily wet and where people could go and be more comfortable there rather than be surrounded by challenges. But I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah, the Rainier program in the downtown east side has a shelter program, but it also has a sober program as well, and so a recovery program as well run through PHS. So it's beneficial. It's not that you have people. One of the things people always ask me is like, especially in the downtown east side now, is like, how do I get sober? And the challenge in that community now is the drug supply has changed so much that I said you gotta leave. And it's tough to leave your community. And I mean, there's people that will say that there's 80% of the people in the downtown east side want to leave the downtown east side. I don't doubt that. I wanted to leave for 31 years and I couldn't leave. That's the challenge. I think you have 10% that you could probably get out fairly quickly to go try something else. But it's the big hardest thing is because even though it's dysfunctional, social isolation, when you're with a community of people, I mean, that's the gift, right? Even though you're connected to something that's dysfunctional and familiar, it's almost, it's like trauma. It's that you wonder why you don't remove yourself from it. It's because it's familiar and it's comforting in its own way that you hold it and you won't let it go. And so one of the things is, for me, is that I realized that I tried it so many different ways that I had to leave. And I walked away from the downtown east side for 4 years. I did not go back. And I remember I even had drug users tell me that I needed to leave. So when you have a community of people saying, you're going to die, and you realize it, and you leave, the other thing that was vital is having the resources in the other community. If you don't have those resources, you'll go back to where you can access those resources. Luckily for me, where I went, which was Surrey, had a wealth of resources in that community that I was in that supported me, and eventually, you start to get better. But it is, I tell people, and I mean, I have a lot of dark humor, but I also try to laugh with people. It's like, you want to stop using drugs and stop hanging around people using them is probably a good step. And everybody on the street agrees with that. It's just the connection is really big. So we have to reconnect people into a community where they're able to thrive. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Another question, which also has me looking around the room and seeing the same thing. Looking around the room, like many of these spaces, there are significantly more women and non-binary people showing care here, despite 3/4 of the toxic drug deaths being men. How do we bring more men into these conversations? How do we work together to reduce the frequency of men using alone?
I think it goes back to relying on Indigenous and cultural-based models to pull ourselves forward. Often, I talk about the work that QomQem does as a housing and harm reduction program, and understanding that we can't, as an Indigenous crew of people, most of us not belonging to the island, the local nations, Songhees and Esquimalt. We're really blessed to have some folks from Wasanich on the team. But we can't be doing this work of housing people on lands where the Songhees and Esquimalt nations and people from Wasanich are still being displaced and disconnected and struggling. You know, sometimes there's up to 10 people living in a house, and this house is super run down. So how do we, as a harm reduction team and a housing team, house people, Indigenous people that aren't from these territories, on lands where the folks that belong to these territories are having it almost just as rough as the people that we're working with. So I talk about how do we do good in one pocket of our Indigenous, group of our family and be causing harm to the local people. And one way that we can move forward through doing that is by leaning on the local nations and by upholding their laws, by upholding their governance and upholding protocol and cultural teachings. And one of those foundational teachings is that we all work together as one. We come together with one goal, with one heart, with one mind. So working together, and in that sense, everybody has a role in what needs to be done. Everybody's coming together. So thinking about that, I think it brings this equity into the conversation about pulling in both, men, women, non-binary. Everybody has a role, and it's the same in our Salish communities. We're all brought up. If you're brought up culturally, you're brought up with something that your family belongs to, that you're going to contribute to the community. And you grow and you know that that's going to be your role moving forward for the rest of your entire life. And the only way that you can ensure the wellness of your community is if you engage and take up that role and learn that role, whether that be a language speaker, whether that be a certain type of dancer, all these things. So we all have a role to play in our communities. We work together as one, and that means that everybody has a responsibility. It's not just women coming together. It's not just non-binary folks. It's everybody needs to maintain that responsibility to the goal in order to achieve it together for the wellness of our people and our nation. So taking that idea and transplanting it into the work that we're doing on a larger scale is really, I think, important. And in that way, too, we're not just benefiting everybody that's struggling with the toxic drug crisis. We're also, working to hold up the local nations in whose territories. We're not silencing them anymore. We're not oppressing them anymore. We're working to uphold them in a way that they've never experienced in this city, really. So it's a valuable way to pull everyone together.
Thank you. I think that would work for non-Indigenous people too.
Another question for all of you, and all of you have spoken about stigma, and you've certainly dealt with stigma in all your public roles, I'm sure. How do you break through to someone who is very resistant? Picture the person who was least likely to even hear you out. What are the technique? What are the words? What are the experience that breaks through to someone when they're sure that they know?
I'll tell you, my father-in-law is heavy conservative, so I can't fault him for that. But one day this was years ago, he was watching the newscast and it had supervised consumption sites on it. And he made a comment saying that all these facilities do is allow people to stay addicted to drugs and eventually they die. And I was sitting there, he was holding my son, his grandson. And then I said, hey pal, you wouldn't be holding that grandson if that supervised consumption site didn't exist, because I wouldn't exist. And I'm serious, it hit him like a ton of bricks because he realized the ignorance of what he said. And he said, I've never thought about that. Guess what happened? I got him a tour of Insight. Darwin took him on a tour and chatted with him. Then guess what he starts doing? He starts, because he's very well connected, he starts getting a bunch of donations, bringing water downtown East Side, helping people on the street, and it changed his perspective. He's also a recovering alcoholic for 31 years. And so for him, it really kind of made a lot of sense. It's like, okay, they help people, I get it. And so ever since then, he's been an advocate. And sometimes I get conservative email because he'll be like, "You talk to my son-in-law guy," and I'm like, oh my God. But it's good to have allies even on that side of the fence that change and be able to be in that whirlwind to change people. So, yeah.
Our stories are the most powerful thing that we as Moms Stop the Harm, and moms who have been impacted, moms and dads, I should say too, I was going to speak on that, but our stories are what reduce stigma. Because when I sit in front of, or speak in front of a group of people who are not on my side about this, if I tell the story of my son, or if I tell the story of anybody's loved one who has died, that people can relate to, they start to see. And so our stories, I'll just leave it there, and as you would know, our stories are the most powerful tool that we have. And we can write, and we should write to our MLAs and our MPs, and go to city councils, and do all of those things, because all of those things are another little step forward towards solving the issue. Stories.
I have an anecdote that bears that out in spades. Years ago, before Mums Stop the Harm, there was a group from Grief to Action in the 90s. And when we were trying to bring the Vancouver Police Department on site to support supervised consumption sites, we would go and we're talking to the chief of police, and we brought people from Grief to Action with us, so that when we said, this is the evidence before it, this is why it would work, and the police would say, well, we think you've got the evidence, but now isn't the right time. To have a parent stand up and say, you're absolutely right, it should have happened years ago, my son, my daughter will still be alive. It just stops the BS. Somebody in the panel wanting to jump in?
Just on the question of stigma and stories and all of this, just to layer a little bit on top of it, all of this. And there's always going to be that one person who's like, but it's illegal.
Oh, but it's illegal.
And so I'm just going to say, I commend any of you to the chapter of the Project Inclusion report that talks about stigma auditing, because it actually talks about how we take a label and we take stigma and we can create a law. We take that and then we add misinformation or misunderstanding, and then we add prejudice, and from there we create a law based on that first fundamental piece of stigma. So when someone says, thank you for your story, but it's illegal, you can take them through a process of, yeah, but that law shouldn't have been like that in the first place, and here's how we could change it. So just kind of layering that policy piece on top of it, because but it's illegal feels like it sticks with folks.
Thank you all so much for that incredible conversation. We will be back for another fascinating presentation on the substances drug checking program and what's been learned about the makeup of the highly variable drugs in our illicit supply. This is Katie Booth and Irene Skolnikov, and they're going to do, they've got a cheering section over there. Their presentation is a drug checking perspective, a look at the current state of the illicit opioid supply in British Columbia. Katie's the project coordinator at Substance, which is the drug checking program on Cook Street, and she's been with the team since 2023. She has a social work background, has worked in harm reduction for 14 years. She's passionate about social justice, collective ethics, and participating in interdisciplinary community-based research and responses that combat the ongoing harms of the war on drugs that impact the people who use them. Irene wears many hats at Substances, including frontline service on the mass spec. I don't even know what that is, but sounds cool. Research and provincial support. She's been with the project since 2021 with a background in biochemistry and neuropsychopharmacology. The work at Substance resonated with Irene because it's punk rock. It gives a direct and important application of her field to society, and it uplifts interdisciplinary research in the name of public welfare. So please welcome Katie and Irene and their presentation on what's in the drugs.
Thanks, everyone. We will be talking today a little bit about drug checking, our services, and some of the trends that we've been seeing over time. But first, let's talk a little bit about what is substance drug checking. So at Substance Drug Checking, we're a group of scientists, social workers, and people who use drugs working together since 2018 and drug checking since 2019 as a response to the opioid toxicity epidemic in BC. We employ gold standard technologies, and we deliver a free and confidential service that is accessible in multiple ways. So in person, by mail, through outreach, collaborative projects, or also through our distributed sites around the island. We are a research project partnered with the University of Victoria, so the Canadian Institute for Substance Use Research, the Faculty of Social Work, the Department of Chemistry, as well as the Department of Computer Science. And we also partner with VIU, so Victoria Island University, with the Applied Environmental Research Laboratory. So a little bit about where we operate. We have a frontline service or a frontline storefront on Cook Street, and we also have distributed sites throughout the island. So there are 9 different outreach sites within Victoria that are predominantly supportive housing sites, and that is done in collaboration with Solid. We also have our distributed model, which is 5 separate sites, where samples are collected in individual locations you can see, like Port Alberni, Campbell River, Comox Valley, Duncan, etc., where folks can drop off their substances, they can get scanned there, and then remotely here in Victoria, we interpret them. And then we also have a provincial pilot, so that provides confirmatory and quantification testing for 12 different sites across BC. And we have been operating drug checking since 2019, and as you can see on the numbers below, that our number of samples have increased tenfold over the last 5 years. So we wanted to talk a little bit about a brief history of drug checking. And drug checking has evolved greatly over time, but it has been around since the 1970s and 1980s, and really was a grassroots movement for people to, it was by the people and for the people. It was a way of community care and a way of folks to care for each other and also provide information throughout a lot of uncertainty. There was a hostile landscape, but it was often really taken up by psychonauts, club kids, and enthusiasts. In the 1990s, there were some more formalized services. They were still niche, but there were things like the DIMS network, which was the Drug Information and Monitoring System in the Netherlands. And that was a way of providing information and also surveillance of what was going on in the current markets at the time, where people would drop off samples, and then they were able to receive information on what was in their sample at a later date. And then there was also Airwood, which is a website by psychonauts for psychonauts. In the 2000s, we saw drug checking enter events and festivals, and it became to be seen as more of a harm reduction measure and a way to potentially address the worries of a changing down supply. And then the 2010s were rife with drug checking evolution into the mainstream as a consequence of opioid toxicity. And we saw really large changes in innovative technological development, proliferation of projects such as the Loop, which is a UK-based, predominantly European service that works throughout music festivals, Get Your Drugs Tested in Vancouver, and Keynote, which is a paid service out of Spain that offers comprehensive drug checking. And then here now we're in the 2020s. The state of drug checking today exists within or peripherally to mainstream healthcare and public health measures. It contributes research, innovation, technological advances, as well as contributes to a long-standing continuum of harm reduction and community care within our landscape. So these are not official eras, but this is kind of, Irene and I talked a lot about this when we were like, how do we break this down between some like really large shifts? And this is what we came up with, but this is not necessarily what you would see in like the specific literature. But we've definitely had so much evolution of down. So opium. The Google machine, when I was looking at that, said 5,000 BCE, but I would argue time immemorial, because how do we really know? Folks have been using substances for pleasure, for remedy, for multiple different purposes from the beginning of time. So it started with opium and then heroin, which was first introduced in 1894, and then predominantly the down samples were heroin until about 2012. The first fentanyl was detected in the illicit supply in 1989 in Canada, but it began to appear more frequently in 2012, and then there was a sharp increase in 2016, which is when BC called the public health emergency. So moving into the modern fentanyl era, in 2019, heroin often contained fentanyl. And that was common, and we rarely saw a benzo. By 2020, it had swapped, where fentanyl sometimes contained heroin and sometimes contained a benzo. So we have seen that massive shift there, and then so here's some numbers. So in 2019, fentanyl was in 80% of down samples, but 32% was heroin, and less than 5% were benzos. But when we get to 2020, fentanyl had surpassed, it was 92%, heroin was about 13%, and benzos were about 20%. By 2021, fentanyl was about 94%, heroin 2 to 4%. So we rarely were seeing heroin any longer, and the fentanyls and analogs had taken over. But the benzos had really also come on board. And so between 2021 and 2024, ranged between 49% and 65% of all down samples contained a benzo. So the future is unpredictable. Changes to prohibitions, to scheduling and different things have made the supply consistently change, and changing to scheduling and enforcement of novel or uniquely emerging substances has increased the volatility of the supply and also the market. So the value of drug checking as an intervention. I'm a social worker, and I think that one of those things is they always ask you about that micro, meso, and macro kind of importance of any type of work that you're doing. And drug checking is often seen as an individual intervention, and it is. It is a fantastic individual intervention. It's a way for folks to be provided with the information of the chemical composition of the substances that they are bringing in, and it's premised upon a right to know as opposed to a premise of risks and harms. And I like to think about that as consent. I think that people deserve to be able to consent to the substances that they are consuming and to understand what is in them. They know their bodies best. Folks are the experts in their own lives. And it also engages folks in harm reduction, and sometimes that is folks that maybe have never engaged in harm reduction, so say they may be more of a recreational user or multiple different ways that people get engaged within services. We get to have those conversations. It also normalizes substance use and reduces the stigma that is both held internally as well as forced upon others externally. From a community perspective, it contributes reporting and information for communities on region-specific trends. So we have multiple different distributed sites over the island. We know that not all down is the same in every single location, but having access to that, we are able to provide that information to the individuals that are coming in to see us, but we also provide community reporting so that folks are able to engage in the information in multiple ways, whether it's their sample or whether it's their community or whether it's something that they're interested in. It gives us an opportunity to connect with people who produce and sell substances to have an upstream impact on the market overall. And it also can help to inform interventions such as safer supply, prescribing, based on the illicit supply trends and concentrations, and understanding what is going on in the market in real time, not what people think is going on in the market. And then from a policy perspective, drug checking creates evidence that can inform policy change, and it also problematizes drug laws that when changes are made to them, increase market and supply volatility, which contributes to increased toxicity and risk environments.
So at Substance, we have access to a variety of different technologies that we can use to analyze the makeup of drug samples. The two that I'll highlight in this presentation are the FTIR and the PSMS. On the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see the FTIR. FTIR stands for Fourier Transformed Infrared Spectroscopy. The way that infrared light interacts with a chemical compound is a function of its physical properties, including elemental makeup and bond arrangement. So the FTIR measures the unique way that infrared light is absorbed and reflected by different compounds and applies a mathematical transformation called a Fourier transform that allows us to generate a spectrum that chemists can then analyze. This technology is widely used among drug tracking projects around the world and is also available at pretty much all of our partner sites that work with us. The FTIR's primary advantage is the wide breadth of compounds that can be detected using it. The primary limitation in the analysis using FTIR is with complex mixtures, as well as with its sensitivity limit, which lies at about 5%. So quantification is not generally possible using the FTIR beyond crude ratiometric analysis in the vast majority of cases with samples. On the right-hand side of the screen, we've got our paper spray mass spectrometer, or the PSMS. So we utilize positive ionization paper spray mass spectrometry for the fragmentation and separation of compounds by their mass and charge to identify and differentiate compounds amongst each other. The mass spec imparts extreme analytical sensitivity. With the mass spec, we're able to detect and quantify a variety of compounds below 1%, including complex multi-component mixtures. A primary challenge, I would say, with the mass spec is that every compound we set out to detect by mass spec must first be acquired as a pure analytical standard and incrementally calibrated. As you might imagine, with compounds that are illicit or are hard to just go out and purchase, this definitely presents a barrier. There are select organizations other than ourselves across the country that have analogous instruments, not necessarily the exact same one, to that, which is the PSMS, including DAS Labs, who provide forensic analysis for the RCMP. So here's a breakdown of all the samples our service received across all of our locations in 2024. You'll notice that opioid down, the category that is opioid down, makes up a significant proportion of the samples we receive, approximately 40%. If you're looking at the screen, that's the big dark blue section here. It's important to highlight that this graph specifically depicts the expected sample composition as disclosed to us by service users. This means that about 40% of the samples brought to us on purpose are expected to be by the consumer of the substance, a seller, or proxy to be illicit opioids. In this case, the distinction between opioid down on the graph and the opioid other category is that opioid other refers to samples expected to be pharmaceutical opioids like Percocet, Dilaudid, etc. Conversely, opioid down samples are expected to contain compounds consistent with the current makeup of the illicit opioid supply. It is also quite interesting to point out here that only about 8% of the samples that we receive are complete mysteries to both us and the service user. That's to say that this sample might be found, it might have been gifted, it might be without label, but for the most part we find that people have at least some concept of what's likely to be in their sample when they bring it to us for analysis. Before we get into the data and the drug trends, it's important that we consider and contextualize what even is the illicit opioid supply and what exactly is down. So down is a term used to refer to any compound expected to be of illicit composition, with compounds that are representative of the circulating supply of street opioids at the time. So right now, fentanyl would be considered down. Back in the 80s, heroin would have been considered down. All of those compounds are all down. Down also refers to all variations, analogs, and co-adulterants that might be consumed in a dose of the street supply. It's important to know that a sample or a dose of down is not generally ever just the active compound itself alone. In the vast majority of cases, down contains some active or a combination of active analogs, potentially some unexpected components added to the mixture to either modulate its effects or replace some other expected compounds. And finally, an inert or non-psychoactive compound, which might function to add bulk, to aid in handling and dosing, and may help the compounds to be more consumable by a specific route, for example, smoked versus injected. I've indicated a few relevant categories in the table on the screen. An analog for the purpose of our conversation here is a compound with a similar structure and generally function to another. Here I've outlined fentanyl, its relative potency compared to heroin, and morphine for anyone who wants a more clinical context. I've also done this for fluorofentanyl, an analog of fentanyl with similar overall effects, but considered to be more potent than fentanyl, about twice the relative potency. Similar information is also indicated for another prevalent analog at the moment, orthomethylfentanyl. And while carfentanil, as you'll see in the presentation, is not very common, and heroin is nearly extinct, I've gone ahead and shown them as analogs too, because they're pretty well known to people. They're often talked about in the media, and we often receive questions about them. So there's many reasons for heterogeneity in the down supply. And when I say heterogeneity, I mean that every down sample is not necessarily going to be the same as another down sample. Some compounds may be considered somewhat interchangeable amongst themselves. These have similar effects and can replace each other in the sample. So this would include our fentanyl analogs. They might replace each other in the supply. Some compounds in the supply are also added because they have synergistic effects to opioids and may potentiate or perpetuate the effects. We know that benzodiazepines, for example, perpetuate the effects of opioids. When consumed together, people reported giving their down something called legs. This is likely an experiential account of the sedative effects of long-acting benzodiazepines. As mentioned on the previous slide, cutting agents may vary depending on how people intend to consume their drugs, but also it depends somewhat on manufacturing, purchasing, legislation at the time, and personal preference. With that, I'd like to walk you through fentanyl analogs observed in the supply over the last few years. So what this figure shows is the proportion of opioid down samples received by substance at our site, which contained one of the listed compounds across time. So for example, if you draw your attention to the very beginning of 2021, at the top left corner of the graph, nearly 90% of the down supply then contained fentanyl. And roughly about 15% at that same time contained heroin. If we follow this way of looking at the data, we can see that over the years, the proportion of samples that contain fentanyl has actually diminished by about 10%, with the lowest year having actually been 2024 so far in our data. At the same time though, you can see the prevalence of the fentanyl analog fluorofentanyl, the sort of more dark purple one, increasing quite dramatically since it first came across our radar in 2021. Finally, at the same time that fentanyl has been dipping down in the supply over the last year, we started to see the most recent common analog, orthomethylfentanyl, and that was in 2024. As you can see, in the samples we analyze, heroin can be considered pretty much an endangered species. We detect it very rarely, and it's usually brought to us by enthusiasts who seek it out. Similarly, you'll notice that we don't see carfentanil very much. We've been detecting it in less than about 10% of the samples proportionally quite steadily since mid-2022. So the previous figure was showing us the proportion of samples which contained our compounds of interest. This figure, by contrast, shows the median quantified percentage of each compound in the down samples. So if we look, for example, to the beginning of 2021 again, we can see that samples that contained fentanyl at the time did so at a concentration of about 12% by weight. Fluorofentanyl was still not very common on the scene then, so we don't see it here, was not very common on the scene still, so we don't see it here. And carfentanil at the time, and for the majority of the time since, as you'll notice, has been in and around about well below 1% in concentration among samples that contained it. So if we remember that carfentanil from previous slides is about 100 times the potency of fentanyl, it makes sense that it's generally present in very low concentrations in samples that contain it. We can see that the analog fluorofentanyl has hovered somewhere between 0 and 10% for the majority of the time that we've been seeing it, with a brief departure from that in late 2023, where it spiked up. The analog orthomethylfentanyl, our newest fentanyl analog that we've been seeing, has hovered around 5% concentration range for the time frame that we've been able to quantify it. Since having reached its peak median concentration in early 2024, fentanyl concentrations have been coming back down in the last year, and especially the last 6 months or so. The same is also true for our fluorofentanyl analog. We can also take a look at benzodiazepines in the down supply over the years. So what this figure illustrates is the proportion of down samples analyzed by substance which were found to contain the benzodiazepine compounds that we list on the screen. One thing you might notice right away is the scraggly purple curve that drops off around mid-2022. So at the time, etizolam, an illicit benzodiazepine with no known medical use in Canada, dominated the supply. At its height, etizolam was being detected by substance in about every second sample that we analyzed of down. You'll also see that since mid-2022, another benzodiazepine has taken over the supply, so the bluer curve to the right. I will call us, given this data, effectively in our bromazolam era right now. Tentatively, we believe bromazolam to be a little more potent, but with roughly similar duration to etizolam. At its highest in late 2023, we were detecting bromazolam in nearly 50% of our samples, and it has since been coming back down in prevalence, and we find it around 25 to 30% of down samples that we analyze in substance. We can also see the rise and fall of a few other benzodiazepines in the dotted lines, kind of down below, over the same time too. We see that flubromazepam, as well as flualprazolam, were two benzodiazepines that saw their peak prevalence between 2022 and 2023. The most prevalent recent new benzodiazepine that we've been detecting is something called desalkylgidazepam. There really is not very much literature on it at this time, but it's thought to be relatively weak but long-acting as a benzodiazepine. So like with fentanyls, we can also observe the medium concentration of our benzodiazepines among samples that contained them across time. So you can see that our original benzodiazepine etizolam started out in the supply below 5%, but experienced quite a bit of growth and variation over time, with the highest median concentration briefly peaking at about 25% in the samples that contained it. So it's pretty significant if you think about the fact that the sample that you're holding onto is about a quarter not what you think it should be, and is actually another active compound. By comparison, we can see also here that our more recent benzodiazepine, bromazolam, has generally stayed pretty close to or below 5% in the samples which contained it over time. The lesser observed benzodiazepines like flubromazepam, flualprazolam, and desalkylgidazepam present with less consistency in samples. It's pretty important to keep an eye on the evolution of benzodiazepines in the down supply because they experience a more dramatic turnover than fentanyls and fentanyl and its analogs. But it sticks around in the supply long enough to potentially influence people's tolerances to polypharmacy samples. The final group of compounds that we'll take a look at are the more recently emerged adulterants in the down supply. These include xylazine, medetomidine, and the nitazines. Here we see their prevalence in opioid down samples across time. So again, this is prevalence. This is what proportion of down samples we're finding them in, if at all. It's likely that you've probably heard or read about these compounds in popular media. They've certainly gained a lot of attention for their presence in the down supply, particularly further east in Canada and in Rust Belt American cities like Philadelphia. Xylazine, also known as tranq, is a non-opioid and non-benzodiazepine veterinary anesthetic. In humans, its most analogous drug might be considered clonidine. Xylazine is particularly well known to clinicians and in the media for its capacity to cause necrotic skin lesions when injected. So you'll notice that xylazine is a little all over the place in the supply as we know it. Since its first detection, xylazine has generally been found in less than 15% of fentanyl samples with a sizable degree of variation. Medetomidine is a veterinary sedative compound similar to xylazine, but with an expected greater relative potency, although there are no human trials. We have only somewhat recently added it to our compound list and have been seeing it in less than about 2% of the down supply to date. The last category we see is a category of opioids called nitazines. These compounds are opioids, but they are unrelated to fentanyl and have received a great deal of media coverage since their rise. Since first having been detected by substance in late 2021, they've seen pretty spotty prevalence in our down supply, mostly being detected in fewer than 2% of samples to date. Different analogs of nitazenes that we find in samples vary from half the relative potency of fentanyl to approximately 5 times the relative potency of fentanyl, with some reported compounds existing at 400 times the relative potency of fentanyl, although we've not detected those. So as with the other ones, and this is where I'll apologize because it gets a little hard to see because the TVs are a little small, but I'll do my best to walk you through the data. Basically, we can observe the concentration at which these adulterants have been detected in down samples. Xylazine in particular, and medetomidine as well, are the only compounds that we have currently, or really ever, detected with any consistency over time. So across the years, xylazine has seen some degree of variation, up to 20% at its peak in concentration in samples, but has somewhat consistently remained at a median concentration below 5% in down samples that contained it. Medetomidine has similarly been observed at a median concentration below 5% in samples that contained it since it was first quantified in 2024 by us. So the remaining compounds underneath it, as you'll see, are certainly of interest to us, but it's hard to comment on any trends in their prevalence and concentration given how sparsely we see them in the local down supply, but we do continue to monitor them. So here's a recap of the trends that we looked at over the last few slides, but we're scaling them to 2024 and 2023, so last year and the year before that. So between this past year and the year before that, fentanyl has seen a roughly 12.6% reduction in the proportion of samples we find it in, but at the same time, it's seen a 4% increase in its median concentration in the samples that do contain it. In other words, it's gotten a little less common, but a little bit stronger. The analog, fluorofentanyl, got significantly less common and just a little bit weaker than the year before that. Bromazolam seems to be slowly on its way down in proportion and ever so slightly increasing in concentration. It's quite important to mention that a person's tolerance, their level of familiarity with their own drug supply, and their patterns of use play a sizable role in the likelihood of someone experiencing a toxicity event. So just because someone has a really potent sample, or maybe they don't, doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to overdose on it. Whether they have a tolerance for that compound, whether they're experienced with using that compound, and frankly, whether they know what's in their drug supply are arguably bigger predictors of whether they're going to have a bad time with that compound. When considering opioid overdose, xylazine and benzodiazepines do not respond to naloxone because they are not opioids, and they do not share common pharmacology with opioids. Nitazenes, on the other hand, as well as all analogs of fentanyl, do share pharmacology with fentanyl, and they do respond to naloxone. Although with nitazenes, there's little literature on it, but clinical reports suggest that one might need to administer a much higher dose of naloxone to reverse an overdose that is either precipitated alone by nitazenes or complicated by them.
So we're going to talk a little bit about some myth busting. I was really grateful to be here for the panel earlier today and to be able to have some of these conversations come up before us. But these are some things that we hear often. So like there's only one certain demographic of people who use drugs. That is categorically false. I have never worked in anywhere that has such a large breadth of demographics of folks that are coming in, and it is an absolutely beautiful thing to see somebody with a certain pocket of information and another person with another pocket of information simply want to connect and share over those pockets of information. We see folks experiencing homelessness alongside folks that own multi-million-dollar homes. We see people pursuing their first psychedelic experience and other folks that have been using drugs longer than I've been alive, and I'm not very young. People purchasing pharmaceuticals online because they don't have access to primary or specialty health care. Folks who have no drugs to check, but they need somewhere safe that they can talk to somebody about substances and somewhere to just sit and be and cry. Number two, fentanyl is in everything. That is something that we see so often in media. We see in a lot of like kind of scare tactics and that kind of like moral panic. From the process or from the samples that we process, we see that fentanyl is in less than 2% of unexpected samples. So it is very rare. It is not something that we see very often, but yet we find that that narrative is quite prevalent and has been over time. The next one, people who sell drugs or drug dealers are all bad people who prey on the vulnerable and are driving force of overdose deaths. People that sell drugs fall in the same continuum as people who don't sell drugs. Some of our most salient regulars at Substance are people who do sell drugs and with whom we formed really trusted relationships. They know that if they stopped producing and supplying to their buyers, that people would find other suppliers. They care about the people that they buy from, and they check their supply to be more informed about what they're selling, and then also to be able to share their insight from what is in their substances with the people that are purchasing. So it is another way, another act of care within like a service provision that we don't question when it is like an interaction in a store with information and a pharmacy, but we seem to look at it a little bit differently when it is in the illicit market. And then finally, we can restrict, criminalize, and persecute our way through a toxic drug supply. People have been using drugs since time immemorial, and different substances have been made licit and illicit back and forth. We've seen that with alcohol, we've seen that with cannabis, and then also opium. So the decisions are all based on like often biased and prejudiced and ill-informed perspectives and opinions rather than like the actual like need to create collective safety. And the down supply persists, but it changes. And so it gets more and more predictable the more we try and like bureaucratically and through laws make our way through it. The ingredients become harder to come by. So like the primary raw components the prices like change drastically, and availability also changes drastically. Well, when we're having to use our instruments and like calibrate it to each and every single component, it's really difficult sometimes to chase some of those quick changes that prohibition has created. The driving force of volatility is the drug supply and prohibitions. With the notion of safe supply, that's what we're getting to at that very issue, is we want to advocate for a drug supply that isn't subjected to the high degree of evolutionary pressure and requirements to change consistently to simply exist. And some barriers and opportunities. The barriers, I'm sure many of us in this room are quite familiar with: criminalization, stigma, lack of adequate funding, and lack of systemic support to be able to provide services that are dictated and for folks who are using substances. Some of the opportunities are really neat, and I'll give you examples of what we do at Substance, but I also want to say that like in a lot of ways, these could be able to be replicated in many other services that are able to employ drug checking. Institutional collaboration. This is a really good example. We collaborate with VIU for the mass spectrometer. And so when Irene was talking about some of the substances are found at lower concentration levels, so like 2.5% or under that 5% threshold, that is an opportunity for us to be able to identify components within samples that are not necessarily able to be seen on an FTIR, which is the most common instrument that is used in drug checking across the province and even across the world. So we are looking constantly for additional innovation, and through collaboration with multiple different services and institutions, we're able to do that. Regional expansion, our distributed model is a really good example of how we can help have drug checking in more rural or other locations that don't necessarily have the infrastructure of a storefront. The communities of care. I think that the biggest thing I want to talk about there is that we don't gatekeep information. So sharing resources, both small and large, are ways that we can care for our community collectively. So the drug checking community has created a community of practice in both BC, Canada, and across the world, where information sharing and collaborative support can create community and can promote increased innovation and also understanding of what's going on in local context, because often there are waves where we can maybe not experience something here, but we can anticipate it coming because we're hearing about it happening in other places. And finally, drug checking is only one piece of a continuum of harm reduction. We are grateful to be able to share research, resources, and hearts with people who use substances and know that this is just one piece of a collective effort that we need to keep our community safer. Thank you. That's our storefront.
Thank you so much to Katie and Irene. That was really interesting. I had no idea about any of that, so thank you very much for that. And many thanks to all of you for being here today, and to the many people from Piers Victoria who have been in the background of this event, ensuring it all runs smoothly. I'm going to hand the mic over to Piers Victoria Executive Director Lee Elliott to thank our cultural workers and introduce one last special guest before we close.
Thanks, Jody. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And for those that don't know, Jody actually used to be the executive director of Piers as well, so we have quite the amount of support here in the building today. I just want to thank all the cultural workers who are here today, Rachel and Sean for opening us up, Gail for being our elder today, and as well as Sophia and John in the back who are doing cedar brushing. If you haven't had a chance to be brushed off yet, they're wonderful, and I highly recommend it. I also just want to call up Jody, Rachel, and Sophia, our organizers for today's event, to thank them for this amazing, amazing series that we did here today. So please come up. Thank you so much. This event was wonderful. If we could give them another big round of applause. And I'd like to call up one more performer. It wouldn't be a Piers event if we didn't try to end today on an uplifting note and talk a little bit about stigma and how that impacts the sex working community as well. So Sarah Smith, if you'd please come up.
Thank you. Hello, dear friends and family. So stigma is real. It's closely linked to criminalization. The criminalization of people who use substances, the criminalization of people who are unhoused, and the criminalization of people who do sex work. All our movements are interlinked and interwoven, and none of us is free until we're all free, of course. Piers has done such great work in destigmatizing sex work, and we continue to do that work around substance use and people experiencing homelessness. So with that in mind, I'm gonna bring it back to stigma and sex work because we're keeping it sexy here. And for those of you who've heard this a million times before, I promise that I will write something new soon. So, bimbo. Okay. Here we go. Who you calling a bimbo? And instead of bimbo, you can put in like drug user or person experiencing homelessness. Who you calling a bimbo? Slut, hooker, whore, prostitute. Because I'm working in my birthday suit, living a life of ill repute. What is it you can't compute? For some of us, it is prostitute or destitute. But you're calling me a whore because there's condoms in my top drawer or I'm stripping on the dance floor? You see, there's just so much that you ignore. There's ways of being unaccounted for, and I want to ask you, how do you make it to the grocery store? How much do you love what you do to make ends meet or be at peace when you fall asleep? You don't really know, though, what it's like. Imagine working in a legal limbo where your customers are made criminal, and every day we survive, it's a miracle because somehow violence, it's forgivable? No. Dear bimbos, I believe we are resourceful. There's no need to be remorseful. We're modern day heroes, working red light windows and stuffing $100 bills in our fishnet pantyhose on a good day. And every other day, and in so many ways, we are shamelessly queering and fearlessly steering our lives for our own damn selves from deep within the patriarchy, and it ain't fucking easy. More so for my kin with black or brown skin, because I've never been in the position you're in, where intersections begin with systemic racism. And to my friends who use substances, there are far less tolerances. And to my sisters on the street, police harassment takes a back seat when the work is considered discreet, because multiple identities put you further from realities of basic human dignities like free speech, life, and liberty. So no, I can't speak for all bodies, but to the rest of you non-bimbos, perhaps you've seen a bumper sticker. It reads, "Someone I love is a sex worker." Well, All the girls I know are pros, and I'm a proud bimbo. Smarter than you'd think we'd be. Together we be simultaneously devising and disguising, surmising and hypnotizing. Most importantly, though, we are normalizing bodies, sex, touch, and intimacy, and it's a truly beautiful thing. We are a secret army of working class asses infiltrating the masses because we are the twerking classes. Professional bimbos making earnings in uncertain legal limbos. We are skanks, fattening piggy banks, and investing with many gracious thanks to society's spank banks. Sluts, hookers, whores, and prostitutes, each fighting for and living our own truths in this humble and honest life pursuit, just like each and every one of you. Bimbo, what you've heard of me, it's true. I've been in more laps than a napkin. But I'm ruthlessly counting the paper that I'm stacking. Because you see, it enables me to take care of me, to fight for my community, to speak out on the fight for sex workers and drug users' human rights, and to cultivate compassion and live out my life with activism and passion. Thank you, friends.
Thank you, Sarah. That was amazing. So nice to have a poet. So thank you, everybody. A big thanks as well to our videographers, John Carswell and Lorraine Skolin, who are doing full recordings of all 3 of our events. Thanks so much, everybody.
you.